We pick up our look at Roman art with commemorative architecture, specifically the Ara Pacis, the Altar of Peace. Some background. As you see, this work was created just around the time of the birth of Christ, 13 to 9 BC. The significance of it, it's one of the most symbolic marble monuments of Augustus's reign. It was originally placed on an exercise ground, a military training ground, called the Field of Mars. And of course, Mars was the god of war. The interesting thing is that it was placed on the Field of Mars, but dedicated to peace. And so, of course, at least part of the message was that war was necessary to maintain the peace. Specifically, it was celebrating the peace of Augustus. He had made peace with the Gauls and returned home, and so that's what was being celebrated. It had been a several-year campaign up into Gaul, and so that was the celebration, the success of that campaign. The history of the building itself is that it fell into ruin in the late Roman era, and as I've mentioned before, really during that era and continuing for many centuries, in Rome, they really didn't think much about their monuments, didn't pay much attention to them, weren't very concerned. In the Renaissance, it was discovered, and every now and then some efforts would be made to restore it, but it was not really seriously excavated and restored, cleaned up, and put back together. It was in very, very bad shape and a lot of pieces until the time of Mussolini, as you see in the 1930s. And he really was on a campaign to bring back Rome and in many ways bring back the Roman Empire. And of course, his hope was that he would be at the head of that. And so we've mentioned how the Romans used art for propaganda in ancient times. Mussolini was wanting to do the same thing. He was wanting to tap into that heritage, the grandeur of ancient Rome. And so he was responsible. He did a lot of terrible things, but he also did some good things in the sense of archaeology, that he really did encourage archaeologists to bring back and to restore many of these monuments. In 2006, the Ara Pacis was placed in this space that you see here. It's a rather modern building, but it really protects the structure, and it also really doesn't take away from it. It just provides sort of a nice, very bright, sunny, as you see, space for the work. The message of the Ara Pacis is peace and prosperity. What is there, and we often do begin with that, what's there. On the inside, it's called the Altar of Peace, and there is an altar on the interior, and there are relief sculptures there that relate to sacrifice, as in animal sacrifice, and the bringing of peace. And then there are elaborate relief sculptures on the exterior, various messages. There are mythological scenes having to do with the glorious history of Rome. There are vines that represent prosperity, as in the crops doing well. And on the sides, which we'll be looking at in just a moment, there are processions on both sides. We're not sure what they're about. They might be just about Augustus's return from Gaul, but many scholars believe that they represent the dedication of this building, the gathering of Augustus and his entourage to celebrate this particular structure and to offer a sacrifice to give thanks for peace. So that seems to be the likely subject of these side space processions. Just looking at another view of the structure. And then a detail of one of the side spaces. I'll let you look at it for a moment, and then on the next slide I do have a few more things to mention. We're reminded of the Sela frieze. You remember that on the Parthenon, there also was a procession. Once again, we're not totally sure of the subject there as well, but this, again, relief sculpture that does clearly represent some sort of a gathering, some sort of a procession. You see a lot of names here. Don't worry about those, but I did put them there for a reason. And it has to do with what you see up top. There are two things here that I wanted to point out. And the first one relates to those names. Recognizable faces. And this contrasts with the Greek generic ideal. You remember that during the classical phase of the Greeks, I used the word generic several times, meaning that the Greeks would combine the best features of several people, but they weren't interested in a recognizable likeness. They weren't interested in accuracy in that way. Usually the Romans were. We'll talk more about that in a bit, but usually the Romans did like recognizable faces, and the people you see here with names have been identified by scholars because of other sources. There might be coins in some cases with some faces on them, or descriptions in various types of literature. And so from various descriptions, as well as sort of linking relationships to people, folks who were spouses or children of certain people, scholars have been able to identify a number of these people. And that is a difference between the Greeks and the Romans. The second thing is, and this is another difference between the Greeks and the Romans, you see some children here. You remember that in the classical phase for the Greeks, their focus was on the young male adult, and they did not portray, in the classical phase, they did not care to portray old people or children. And again, here we have several. Now, part of that might have to do with politics, that Augustus was wanting to point out that he had sort of a guaranteed lineage in terms of people to succeed him. But there also was concern in Rome at this point regarding immigration. They were finding that Roman citizens were being outnumbered. The original Romans were being outnumbered by immigrants. And so there was a real concern that people were marrying later, having less children. And so during this time, Augustus really instituted a number of policies, including tax breaks, for people to have more children. And so there was very much of an emphasis on family values, family life. And so it's believed that that's another reason for including the children here, saying that Augustus was a family man, as it were, and he had a special event, and they even brought the kids. So this idea of focusing on children and families and encouraging larger families was a political message. But it also is a difference between the Greeks and the Romans, that they would include children in their portrayal here. So the Ara Pacis is a commemorative work of architecture. It is architecture in the sense that a priest would go inside the structure at least once a year to offer a sacrifice, but it really is most important for the message, the relief sculptures. That is true with this work as well, the Column of Trajan. It is a structure one could go inside, in the sense it is this very tall column. It's kind of like a lighthouse. There was a ladder inside, but it was really more for maintenance. It was not that on a regular basis people were expected to be able to go into this. So once again, it is really more important as a very large, very elaborate sculpture. It's most important for the messages it conveys. The Column of Trajan has been called by historian Daniel Boorstin the most complete visual record of any military event in antiquity. The Column of Trajan basically reads like a documentary. It starts at the bottom And this is a ribbon of relief sculptures. You can see, you'll have some details later, but you can see these lines here. And what this is just this ribbon of sculptures that weaves its way from the bottom all the way up to the top. And really, it is a military documentary. This wouldn't be a very elegant title, but you could basically entitle it, "This is How We Wage War," speaking of the Romans, because really we see so many things in terms here. You see the artillery, for example. We see how they would build fortifications, how they would cross rivers, how they would take prisoners, how Trajan would be giving them pep talks quite often. All of those things, their uniforms, their weapons, all of those things we see. And so it's a work of art. It is also a work of military history. Now, it's very tall, and so one of the logical questions would be, well, how could you read it? How could you interpret it? Because you would be down here on the ground. How could you figure any of that out? Well, no doubt it would be difficult, but it would have been easier back then. It would have been more visible for two reasons. One is that there were surrounding buildings very close, and so you could go up to some of the upper levels of these buildings and look across, and it would have been easier to see the work and to see what was being portrayed. Also, we have evidence that similar to the ancient Greeks, the structure was originally painted. And so now, of course, it's just pretty much solid white, and therefore it's harder to distinguish the different things being represented. But in its day, it would have been more colorful and therefore easier to read, as it were. To understand the column of Trajan, we also need to mention another, we might say, creation of Trajan, or something he had done during his day, the market. And so you see here in downtown Rome, you see Trajan's column, and really not far away at all was this market, basically a shopping mall. And it's really quite interesting, the creation of it and just the design of it. It really is multi-storied, and there were individual stalls inside for the various shops. And so it very much is like what we know as a shopping mall. This was an engineering and a design feat in the day. The situation was that there was a hill here, basically of solid rock, and it had to be excavated. Trajan wanted to build this market for the people. It would be something, again, to keep people happy, something to provide for the populace. And in order to make that happen, they had to excavate this rock hill. And so again, with the tools of the day, that was a very daunting task, but they were able to achieve that. So that's in particular the success story of this. Another interesting thing is you see here it is semicircular. It is using the arch principle because the architect understood it's an arch on its side as opposed to arches that you would walk through, for example. But he understood that an arch would be a more stable design. And so he purposely made it, rather than just straight across, he purposely made it in this semicircular way. But what happened was Trajan had this market built. It was this great achievement, this gift to the people, we might say, and the achievement of the excavation. And scholars have figured out that the height of what had to be excavated is the height of this column. And so one of the things, this column celebrates several things. One of them is this excavation project. Here you see the, we'll call it shopping mall again, and I just wanted you to see the interior as well. We have the vaulting of the ceiling, and you can see here the upper and lower levels. And so again, something that strikes us as really pretty modern. And so you can see the upper and lower levels and little hints there of the entryways to the different shops. So a little more about the Column of Trajan. We're not quite sure of the date, but as you see, around 117 AD, it does celebrate that mammoth excavation project. More particularly, in terms of the relief sculptures, it celebrates Trajan's victory over the Dacians. Dacia was an area in what we would call Eastern Europe, where now the Romanians live, the area known as Romania. And that area had resisted conquering for quite some time. There had been multiple efforts and there had been no success. Trajan was able to conquer those people and bring them in as part of the Roman Empire. The reason that was so desirable was because of the wealth it would bring, because that area was quite rich in mines, both gold and silver mines. And so they wouldn't have cared so much. It's a beautiful region, but they wouldn't have cared so much about it except for that wealth it could bring. And so it really meant a lot when he and his troops were able to conquer that area. As I said, this is a continuous ribbon of reliefs. You can see better here these dividing lines. It looks like a ropes going up here. But again, you would begin reading this at the bottom, and then it would just spiral around and around, and these lines divide one section from the next. Very valuable for military historians. There are over 2,500 figures in this. I don't know who sat around and counted, but there are over 2,500 figures, and they are linked not only by the storytelling, of course, focusing on how we wage war, but landscape. There are little hints in the background at times of landscape, of architecture, and Trajan himself. For example, right here, and this happens several times throughout the work, but here you can see him addressing his troops, giving them a pep talk, as it were, and he does that several times. The example you have is this lowest example, which is called the Romans crossing the Danube. And they had various ways of doing that. In this case, they have actually lashed some boats together. I think this would be a rather bumpy walk here across the river, but they've lashed some boats together, put a makeshift sort of wooden structure across that, and they are marching across the river. The god of the Danube River has come up out of the water, as it were, and is watching as they cross the river. But again, it's very, very rich throughout in terms of the activities that are taking place. Another commemorative work is the Arch of Titus, as you see from around 81 AD. It is here in the famous Roman Forum, and just over the hill. You can walk through it. Again, it is a work of architecture with a barrel vault on top. It's out exposed to the elements and has been all of this time. You can walk through that. If from right here you walked through it, just the equivalent of a couple of blocks, maybe not even quite that, would be the Colosseum, and over to your left, you can't see it here, is the Basilica of Constantine. So a number of very significant works. Again, it's in the Roman Forum. This is a very fine example, but many triumphal arches were erected by the Romans. This design actually was a Roman innovation. We've mentioned that often the Romans were more borrowing than being creative, but this was an innovation of the Romans. And these kinds of structures would commemorate military exploits of a victorious general or emperor, and sometimes they were one and the same, but it would commemorate a military victory. They're part architecture, part sculpture, again, because you can walk through them, and as it were, there's a bit of a covering, but again, it's more important for what it says in terms of the message of the sculptures. They are freestanding gateways. In ancient times, of course, cities were typically walled, and there would be entryways into the city in that sense, but these were special structures that would be freestanding. I wanted to talk a minute about the Roman practice, and we will see it also in words and in images reiterated in a moment, looking in more detail at the Arch of Titus. But the situation was a general, an emperor, would go away to some distant land, have military exploits, as it were. If you were a Roman, no doubt, ultimately you would be victorious, and you would come back to Rome in triumph. There would be, of course, a big holiday, a big event, and it would be really the sort of high point would be a parade. And you would have in that parade the soldiers, you would have slaves, you would have the plunder that had been brought back, whatever that might be, the riches of the land that you had captured and defeated. And then at the end of this parade would be very similar to Santa Claus at the end of the Christmas parade. At the end of the parade would be the victorious general in a chariot. And so that was sort of the standard portrayal. They would, in many cases, if a permanent triumphal arch had not yet been erected, as I understand it, they would often have a temporary one that they would go through, and then the Senate would proclaim that a permanent monument should be made. And so that's what we see here. There was something of a standard format. There might be 3 openings instead of 1, but this was pretty standard that you would have a message up top as to what it was about. You would then below have, of course, a passageway, and quite often then elaborate relief sculptures reiterating the message in some way. Often on top, there would be typically out of bronze, there would be a sculpture, again, sort of a chariot scene, often with horses, sometimes even elephants. But those, in many cases, were destroyed or stolen over time, so they're quite often missing. But there would often be something up top in terms of reiterating the message again with a chariot-type scene. I'll reiterate this in a moment also with Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem, so more about that in a moment. But the inscription here, just so you know, this very neat Latin script up here, says the Senate and the Roman people to the deified Titus Vespasian Augustus, son of the deified Vespasian. So it's kind of a mouthful, but it was dedicated to, again, Titus for his victory. So the background of this has to do with something that happened about 10 years before this was completed, Titus's capture of Jerusalem in 70 AD and his putting down of an uprising. There was an uprising among the Jews in Jerusalem. Titus came in and very brutally put down the uprising and sacked the temple. And so that is what this arch is celebrating. And I choose it on purpose because it does overlap really with Judeo-Christian history. So I find this one particularly interesting for that reason. So as I said, I wanted to mention also this idea of a triumphal entry into a city, because we think of this when we think of Palm Sunday. And this is interesting. This is a work we won't be officially studying this one. It comes from sort of the early Renaissance, sort of the century that leads into the official Italian Renaissance. An artist named Duccio created a painting called Christ Entering Jerusalem. So, of course, it is the Palm Sunday story. So we've got Jesus here on a donkey. People are throwing down their garments, waving the palm branches. What I wanted you to notice in particular is that as he makes his way, he's going through a triumphal arch. And so it just was very natural for an artist in the 1300s, knowing the ancient Roman customs, no doubt having seen some triumphal arches, to think in those terms. And of course, Jesus living in the Roman Empire, the Roman era, this was part of the mindset of the time. Of course, he comes in humility and ultimately to die, so it's a very, very different circumstance. But this idea of an important person entering a city in triumph was something that was very much a part of the culture in the ancient Roman era, and Christians would have understood that as well. And you'll notice with this detail over here, we'll look at it again in a moment, the full work. Here you can see some of the prisoners in the procession that is represented. Again, more about this in just a moment, but you'll see that they are walking through a triumphal arch as well. So on the inside of the Arch of Titus, first of all, I just want to call attention to the beautiful coffers here, very, very ornate, up on the ceiling here of the barrel vault. On each side, if you were standing underneath that ceiling, you could look to the left and to the right, and you would see these beautiful panels that do relate again to the parade, we will call it, this military triumphal parade through the city. And so what we have really here is, again, this idea of a documentary. The idea, it's as if we're there, we're watching the parade, we're standing there, you can imagine all of the music and the shouts and the excitement. The soldiers and the slaves, we see people with their hands bound behind their backs here, and you see all of these soldiers bringing plunder from the temple. And you'll notice that they swing toward us. The relief gets deeper right here as they get closer to the observers, and then the parade sort of turns away from us. They kind of curve around, and then that's when they go through the triumphal arch. So we're looking at a triumphal arch, and the image shows people going through a triumphal arch. But you'll notice these people are a little bit smaller and a little bit flatter to suggest that they're slightly further away. Another reason I chose this particular work is because we have an eyewitness account. Josephus was, as you see here, a Jewish historian, and he was in Rome the day of the parade that I'm describing. And I think this is really exciting in a way to hear an eyewitness account of what took place, which is also what is portrayed in this work of art. So we really see sort of a combination there of words that reiterate the scene and then the images as well. As I understand it, Josephus was a bit of a controversial figure. He was Jewish, but he had encouraged the Jews against an uprising. And some people at the time thought it was because he was something of a traitor. He wasn't being supportive. Others say no, he just knew that it would not be successful and that there would be a very bad outcome, and so he was trying to protect them from that. So it's hard to know this long ago, but it is interesting that he does comment about this event. So listen to an eyewitness account of the parade, as we will call it, celebrating the return of the troops from Jerusalem. Spoil in abundance was carried past, none of it compared with that taken from the temple in Jerusalem. A golden table, many stones in weight, and a golden lampstand similarly made, which was quite unlike any object in daily use. A center shaft rose from a base, and from the shaft thin branches or arms extended in a pattern very like that of tridents, each wrought at its end into a lamp. Some of those are just damaged now. There were 7 of these lamps, thus emphasizing the honor paid by the Jews to the number 7. A tablet of the Jewish law was carried last of all the spoil. After it came a large group carrying statues of victory, all of them made of ivory and gold. For on that day the city of Rome made holiday for their victory in the war against the Jews, for the end of civil disorder, and for the rising expectations of peace and prosperity. So again, really fascinating how he describes what he saw and what we see in this work of art. And then here, just another close-up of that with the plunder, the soldiers with the plunder, the what seemed to be prisoners, and then stepping into the triumphal arch. And this is what we see on the opposite side. We have a chariot scene meant to represent Titus in his chariot with the horses. It's called the Triumph of Titus, with good reason. There were representatives here. Scholars have identified this figure as representing virtue, this figure as representing honor, and again, there is a victory, a winged victory figure behind Titus. You see him here in the chariot with the horses. This winged figure would have been placing, it's somewhat damaged, but you can still tell that this figure is placing a wreath of victory on Titus's head. So again, he's deserving of honor. He's exhibiting virtue. He has brought us victory. We leave architecture now and we talk about sculpture. First of all, Roman portraiture. One of the things they liked to create were neck-up views. They're called portrait busts or just busts. And what that means is sort of a neck, from the neck up and the head. And they created a lot of those. I want to highlight the difference between Roman and Greek sculpture. And so first of all, talking about Roman portraiture that exhibits realism compared to the Greek. And when we talk about the Greeks, even though we also looked at the Hellenistic era, when we generally say what the Greeks did, we mean during the classical phase. And so in the classical phase with the Greeks, as you remember, they focused on the ideal, the composite of the best features of multiple people. Typically with the Romans, they were different. They preferred realism, warts and all, as the expression goes. If you were old and wrinkled and bald-headed and went to a sculptor and said, please recreate my image, I would like to have a bust sculpture, don't come back in a couple of weeks and be disappointed that you don't look like a movie star. What you see is what you get. They actually liked that. I tell that as if this man would have been disappointed, but they really did, in general, like that truth and honesty. If they were older and wrinkled, for example, there was I think in the culture at the time, there was a lot of respect for older people and a feeling that you had earned those wrinkles, as it were. And so that was almost a point of pride. And so in most cases, we're going to see a significant exception. But they did like verism, as it's sometimes called, or we just typically say realism, accuracy. Now, I want to talk a minute about something of where that came from, and it seems a little macabre, but I think it'll make sense when I explain it. What you see here is a man, the title is often given as a Roman patrician with his ancestors. The Romans had a custom, particularly in the upper classes, folks who were very proud of their heritage, often had an impressive family tree. There was a custom that when a person died, while they were still sort of there at the home on the bed, as it were, you would call in an artisan, and they would come in with a pot of hot wax. They would place that on the face of the deceased and, of course, press that in, and it would create a mold of the deceased, and obviously it would look exactly like the person because it had been formed on their face. It was called an homogeneous in Latin. You could keep those, but of course, being wax, it could melt, it could get dusty, it would not survive very well over time. So quite often what they would do would be to then hire someone to use that as the model and to recreate that in a permanent form out of stone. And so that was a very common accepted custom, and they were again very proud of their heritage, their family tree, and so you wanted to preserve the image of those who had gone before. And they actually had a place in their homes. And in Pompeii, for example, some of the homes that have been excavated, there is a space, kind of like an office, a space where these images would be kept up in the head. And they created a lot of those. I want to highlight the difference between Roman and Greek sculpture. And so first of all, talking about Roman portraiture that exhibits realism compared to the Greek. And when we talk about the Greeks, even though we also looked at the Hellenistic era, when we generally say what the Greeks did, we mean during the classical phase. And so in the classical phase with the Greeks, as you remember, they focused on the ideal, the composite of the best features of multiple people. Typically with the Romans, they were different. They preferred realism, warts and all, as the expression goes. If you were old and wrinkled and bald-headed and went to a sculptor and said, please recreate my image, I would like to have a bust sculpture, don't come back in a couple of weeks and be disappointed that you don't look like a movie star. What you see is what you get. They actually liked that. I tell that as if this man would have been disappointed, but they really did, in general, like that truth and honesty. If they were older and wrinkled, for example, there was I think in the culture at the time, there was a lot of respect for older people and the feeling that you had earned those wrinkles, as it were. And so that was almost a point of pride. And so in most cases, we're going to see a significant exception. But they did like verism, as it's sometimes called, or we just typically say realism, accuracy. Now, I want to talk a minute about something of where that came from, and it seems a little macabre, but I think it'll make sense when I explain it. What you see here is a man, the title is often given as a Roman patrician with his ancestors. The Romans had a custom, particularly in the upper classes, folks who were very proud of their heritage, often had an impressive family tree. there was a custom that when a person died, while they were still sort of there at the home on the bed, as it were, you would call in an artisan. I picked on this fellow, but it's nice to see a detail as well, close up of this work. And you can see again just the very specificity in terms of all of those wrinkles and such. We have evidence again that quite often the eyes might have been painted in at the time, or other times they would use a drill to actually carve out the pupils of the eyes to give them a more accurate likeness. We don't have that here. No doubt the paint is missing, so it gives a little bit of an eerie impression there. But notice how specific the head, the ears, everything very, very detailed, very realistic. But there were exceptions, and this is one of the most notable, the Augustus of Prima Porta, as you see from the early 1st century. We'll be talking a good bit about the messages of this work. Here is a detail, we'll see this again, but incredibly beautiful carving, just the drapery here and the details of the military uniform. And we do see a reminder again, although this is obviously a militarily clothed figure, but the pose is that of the contrapposto, one leg bearing the weight, etc. And so we see that Greek influence here, even though, again, the Romans are making it their own. They're going their own way, but there is some Greek influence. There's a lot on this slide. I'll unpack this. The summary of it is at the top. I like to say that this work is like a resume. This is a resume for Augustus. What I mean by that is that it really highlights how wonderful he was, basically. It is a propaganda message of, we love you, Augustus. We are glad Augustus is our emperor. And so they really heap praise on him in a way by touting his accomplishments. So that's what most of what we will be walking through on this page has to do with these resume type. In other words, these various aspects of his character and particularly of his accomplishments. So celebrating who he is and his accomplishments. This work is also notable because it does combine the real and the ideal. So the classical Greeks favored the ideal. Most of the time the Romans favored the real. This work combines them. It is recognizable as Augustus. More about that in a moment. So if someone saw this at the time, they would immediately know who this was supposed to be, but better. And so again, recognizable, so you really would know if we're going to honor this person, we really want to know who we're honoring. So we have realism, recognizability, but better. So let's walk through what that means. So first of all, recognizable. These are some Roman coins from Augustus's day. And by the way, the title of this is the Augustus of Prima Porta. I often just refer to it as the statue of Augustus because it is the only one that we are studying. Many were created, but that title, the longer title, has to do, Prima Porta was a villa that belonged to Augustus's wife, and it ultimately was found there. We believe that during his day it was placed publicly, again, so that it would be celebrating his accomplishments in a public way, but it was ultimately found at her villa, and so that's why it's called the Augustus of Prima Porta. But we'll just say the statue of Augustus. So here we see these Roman coins. Augustus had distinctive features just in terms of facial shape and such, and he also had kind of a quirky situation, almost a Harry Potter sort of situation with his hair, that right there in the middle, the arrow may cover it up a little bit, but his hair tended to fall into a bit of a part right there in the middle, and that was kind of a quirk that was distinctive of Augustus. And so his facial shape and especially his hair are realistic. He is identifiable. But again, he's idealized. Let's go ahead and talk about how he's idealized. He is shown as handsome, as tall, serene, as in control, and eternally young. The sculpture is, you don't need to remember these numbers, but almost 7 feet tall, 6'8". He was about 5'4". He looks really pretty young. We figure he was at least 50 when this work was created. He could have even been in his 70s. We're not sure, but he certainly was not as young as he is portrayed. So that's what we mean by idealized. You can tell it's Augustus, but he's sort of cleaned up and putting his best foot forward, as it were. Handsome, tall, serene, as in calm and in control, and looking young. So real and ideal. Now let's get to some of the resume type aspects, the little bit more specific aspects. He is a soldier. He is shown in a military dress uniform, sort of their official dress-up, kind of a fancy uniform, but he's identified as a soldier. He is holding a scepter, which is a symbol of power. This gesture was very common in Roman art, and it is a sign of an orator. We saw it with Trajan actually addressing his troops. Very common to show the leader giving an address. They very much valued rhetoric, speech giving, and so here he is shown as a gifted orator. He has also brought peace, prosperity, and has authority. We'll see this a little bit more on the next slide. But in the middle of the breastplate here, right here, we see a scene of an enemy returning army standards. Those were like flags, as it were, these symbols on sticks that would be carried into battle. And it was a very, very important. They were very proud of these, and it was really a sign of success, and very much the Roman military identified with those standards. We don't mean, sometimes students get confused, we don't mean standards as in discipline and obeying the rules. That's not what we mean here. We mean that he literally was able to get these emblems of the Roman military back. An enemy had stolen them. It had been a big humiliation to the military, and Augustus was able to get those returned. So it was considered a major diplomatic achievement. So far we see he's a soldier, he has power, he is a great speaker, he has brought peace, prosperity. We'll see that a little bit more on the next slide, but peace, prosperity, he has authority, he can throw his weight around and get his way, as it were. And if that isn't enough, he's divine. Down here we see a little cherub-looking figure. It represents Cupid. Cupid riding a dolphin. Cupid was the son of Venus, and Augustus traced his ancestry back to Venus. So this little Cupid figure here is not just meant to be cute, it is meant to remind us of Venus and Augustus's supposed divine ancestry. He also is shown as barefoot. And in this time period, that was shown, that was viewed as a sign of divinity. As one author has said, only mortals needed to wear boots. So Augustus is recognizable, but better, and he brings all of these things to the table with the military, with power, with speech making, bringing peace, prosperity, throwing his weight around, as it were, with authority, and he's divine. So here is the detail, and again, just notice the exquisite carving. This is at the Vatican Museum, and you can see here even these little sort of tassels or tassels, whichever you prefer, but look at the epaulets there with the creases and even some of the threads there that are sort of twisted in a very realistic way. And then down here as well, the pleats, the folds of the drapery, just exquisitely carved. But I mentioned peace, prosperity, and authority. Peace, this fellow right here is a celestial deity, and this arched canopy here really represents the heavens. And so it's basically a figure. It's meant to represent peace, kind of presiding over the scene and bringing blessing to Augustus and his efforts. In the middle is that returning of the standards scene. Again, it was Augustus's diplomatic victory. This is the enemy, the Parthians, but we don't need to worry about that. But this is the enemy, and here he is holding that standard, and he is returning it to this person. This is actually the top of one of those standards. I believe it's actually at the Cleveland Museum, but this is the top of one of those standards. And then in addition, he is bringing prosperity. And the way of showing that, you have this representation, this personification of Mother Earth holding a cornucopia. We often call it a horn of plenty. Right here we associate it, think of it a lot at Thanksgiving, for example. And so that symbol there has to do with, and that's why we use it at Thanksgiving as well, with abundance and the harvest, with prosperity, that kind of an idea. So the bottom line is this sculpture is blatantly, really, a work of propaganda celebrating Augustus in every respect. Not only his physical appearance, but also his accomplishments. The final thing that remains is to look briefly at painting. And we have two examples of paintings from Herculaneum and Pompeii. So I wanted just to mention Pompeii very briefly. We could spend many of these things. Just the Colosseum, for example, or the city of Pompeii could be a course in and of itself. They're very, very rich, fascinating, either works of art or places, and there is much that could be said. But I want to mention Pompeii here. The reason we mention it is because it is a very well-preserved city, and we do have many wall paintings, among other things, that remain from Pompeii. You're no doubt aware of the tragic story of this prosperous town near the coast with many, many beautiful buildings, homes, gardens, entertainment spaces. They were living the good life, totally unaware, seemingly, that they were living in the shadow of a disaster, Mount Vesuvius. They seem to have forgotten that that's why the land was so fertile. It's because it was volcanic. And on a very nice, warm summer day in 79 AD, Mount Vesuvius erupted. Scholars estimate that the plume went about 6 miles into the sky. Some people were able to escape, but of course, tragically, many were not. And the city really was frozen in time, terrifically hot, but frozen, as it were, in time. Excavations began in the 1700s. In fact, it was one of the things we will later be talking about, the neoclassical era. The 1700s, the second half of the 1700s, was a time when they looked back again to this era, to Greece and to Rome, with great admiration. So we call it the New Classical in the 1700s. And one of the things that brought about that craze for things Greco-Roman again was that excavations began at Pompeii. And so a lot of news was coming out of Pompeii as to the discoveries, and it led to a real fascination with this. So they began excavating in the 1700s, and they are still at it. It's really a mad dash to try to preserve what has already been excavated and exposed to the elements, and also they continue to excavate and make new discoveries at Pompeii. Just a few images here. You do see, of course, Mount Vesuvius and part of the Forum area. The main reason that I mention it, as I said, is because there are many wall paintings. Some have been removed to museums, especially the Archaeological Museum in Naples, which is quite fine. And of course, it's great because then it preserves the works, and the two works that we will look at briefly are in that museum in Naples. But in many cases, the paintings are on the walls that are part of buildings. And so now they are just exposed to the elements. But it is wonderful when you walk around because you see these. Of course, they're damaged, but you get a sense of how it would have looked back in the day. This is just another, it's looking out, but this would be the entrance to one of the homes. And you do see many of these haunting images as you make your way around Pompeii. Archaeologists, as they were sort of tapping around and making their discoveries, they noticed that they would hear a hollow sound at times. And when they poured plaster into that, they realized that those were some of the spaces of some of the deceased. And so you see these really haunting images throughout, really, as you walk around Pompeii. This is just one of the lovely courtyards. In their houses, they would have sort of the public spaces, often like a shop, for example, near the street. And then you would make your way back through kind of an office area, and then ultimately the more family, private spaces, and the rooms would be around an open courtyard. And a lot of their living, it was a very nice climate, and a lot of the living, eating, receiving friends, all of that would be out in the open air. And again, you can see some of the paintings in the background. I'm not going to spend much time on it now because we talk about it in more detail later, but I just wanted to mention perspective because perspective is relevant for the works that we're looking at least to some degree. And I just wanted you to be aware that linear perspective is something that the ancients were aware of. The Greeks and the Romans knew how, on a flat surface, to create a painting that would look as if it had depth. In other words, certain objects you could tell were closer to you and others would be further away. And so they understood that objects in the distance appear smaller. This is just an internet example with a little Dutch guy here. And you see he appears smaller in the distance. And that parallel lines, such as the sides of the road or the sidewalk, seem to converge at a point in the distance. They understood this. We have evidence that the Greeks used this knowledge particularly for theater. They would create sets, paintings as backdrops for their plays that looked very realistic, and they developed perspective in order to make them look quite believable. Again, those things have almost totally been lost. The Romans also used these techniques in particular to decorate their homes. They often would have very few windows in a lot of the rooms, and they would paint the walls sort of like we would use wallpaper to relieve the eye. But I just wanted you to be aware that the Greeks and the Romans did understand perspective and use it. It was then forgotten throughout the Middle Ages for about 1,000 years. And then we give Brunelleschi credit in the 1400s. We sometimes say he invented it, but he basically, we might say, rediscovered it. He demonstrated these principles again, anew, and they started to be used and really caught on extensively at that point and were used for several hundred years, as we will see. But I'd like you to understand that these are principles from ancient times that will then stage a comeback later on. So just briefly, the two examples, Still Life with Peaches and Water Jug is the first one. It comes from the sister city. Pompeii and Herculaneum were very close to one another and were both destroyed in that eruption of Mount Vesuvius. And this work, again, is called Still Life with Peaches and Water Jug. Not a very creative title, really, because that's just what it represents. You see some steps here. Someone has broken off a branch of some peaches. I always joke that I'm from South Carolina and I know how peaches should look, and these look pretty green to me, but they have broken off this branch from a peach tree on the steps, and so this step is closer to us, and then this one is further away. And then, as the title suggests, there's also a jug of water. And so it's really a very simple work, but this was the kind of subject that was very popular with the Romans. Ordinary objects. A still life just means that. An assemblage of ordinary objects, often kitchen-type objects, food and containers for food and such. And they often would have these kinds of things portrayed in their homes, on their walls, in their dining area, for example. So again, we have a little sense that this clear jug of water and these peaches are closer to us, and then these are a little further away, so a little sense of depth, perspective. And then we see another way that the Romans made art look believable has to do with shading and shadows. So by shading, they're really pretty much the same thing. Shading just means on the object, and shadows then are cast by the object. But both terms have to do with simply how light works. And so looking at the peaches, we see that they're not painted as one shade of green. We have the lighter and the darker, and that makes them look more rounded and three-dimensional. And then, so that's the shading, and then the shadows, you see the peaches casting a shadow on the step, in this case, the leaves, the branches doing the same thing. Here's a very nice shadow here of the leaf, and here, and the water jug as well. So very, very sensitive to how things look, and using these techniques of perspective and shading and shadows to do that. And you can see, for example, the skill also of this clear glass jug with the water in it, and notice the reflection of light along the side. And our last example comes from Pompeii, this couple. It's called The Portrait of a Magistrate and His Wife. Some scholars believe that these folks, actually, they believe that they know them by name, Terentius Neo and his wife. We see an example of portraiture, and it seems that we have realism going on, just as we did with those portrait busts, the sculptures. These, no doubt, would be recognizable people. Interestingly, they're showing signs of education, which was something people were very proud of at this point. He is holding a scroll. She is holding, which was a very common writing tablet. Back then it would have wax in it. And she's holding a stylus here, a tool that she could then mark her lists or her journal or her writings, whatever it might be. But it was a wax, sort of a notebook, as it were. So we have these signs of education. They're realistic looking in terms of their facial features, hairstyles, those kinds of things. And you do see some shadows, rounded three-dimensional suggestions, and we can see some depth. She's a little bit closer to us. They overlap here, her shoulder and arm, a little bit in front of then his hand and his shoulder. We believe that they were business owners in Pompeii, sort of circumstantial evidence of where these images were found on the wall, suggests that they owned perhaps even a couple of bakeries, and this is one of the bakeries in Pompeii. You see the brick oven in the background, and then these areas are where they would grind grain. They would pour grain down in here, and then donkeys or horses would be attached here to some rods, and they would walk around grinding the grain. Some scholars even believe that these people were Christians. There was a Christian community in Pompeii, and some people identify these folks as Christian business owners who maybe even made a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. So I find that quite fascinating. And here is just a close-up of the two. Again, recognizable features, the light shining there, sort of casting a bit of a light on the bridge of their noses, shadows, recognizable features, even down to the fancy hairstyle. And it's kind of hard to tell, but she's wearing earrings as well. So next time we move into early Christian art and music and the Romanesque.